In the deep dark of the galaxy, far beyond the reach of even the oldest stars visible to man, there are places where time no longer passes as it should, and memory weeps into reality like a bloodstain through parchment. There, in the silence between pulses of creation and ruin, echoes drift, ancient, mournful, thunderous. These echoes do not belong to mankind, nor to the Imperium, nor to any living race that claims dominion over the stars. Number. These echoes belong to a war older than history, older than language, older even than the warp's awakening. They belong to the first war, the first and greatest of all. It is called the War in Heaven. To speak of this war is to conjure the shadows of gods and empires that no longer exist. No cogitator in the Librarius of Terra holds a complete record of it. No Eldar Farseer can recall it in full, though their race were once its children. Even the Necrons, who fought and bled and murdered their way through its fiery heart, preserve only fragments, encoded in tomb complexes buried beneath eons of silence. It is a tale of such age that even the stars it was fought beneath have, in many cases, burned out and died. And yet, it is no myth. The war in heaven was real. Long before the Imperium rose from the flames of old Earth, before the Eldar crafted their dream empire in the stars, before the gods of chaos stirred in the immaterium, there were two forces at play in the galaxy: life and death. Not abstractly, but as civilizations, one sought to spread life, to mold it, to elevate it. The other raged against the cruel brevity of life, against the tyranny of entropy and the certainty of mortality. These two would meet, and they would shatter each other against the other's will. The galaxy at that distant time was in its youth. Stars blazed bright and untouched. Worlds were quiet, some already teeming with primitive life, others waiting in stillness. Into this fertile cradle came the first great civilization, the Old Ones. They were masters of the biological and the psychic, beings of patience and purpose, slow to act but vast in vision. They saw the galaxy not as a thing to conquer, but a thing to shape. Through subtlety and science and sorcery, they seeded life on 1,000,000 worlds, lifting up species from slime to sentience. They built pathways between stars, webway gates, still used today by the Aldari, through which their vast minds moved like wind through ancient branches. They did not rule so much as tend, and in their tending, life grew strong, and life drew envy. Far across the stars, beneath a pale dying sun, another people had risen, the Necrontyr. If the Old Ones were the gardeners of life, then the Necrontyr were its bitter cousins, born in its shadow and twisted by despair. Their world was cruel, a blasted radiation-ravaged place where the sun's touch was poison, and the air itself whispered death. Their lives were short, consumed by illness and suffering, and their culture grew around the idea of loss. Tombs, not homes, were their greatest architectural triumphs. They measured power not in dynasties of rule, but in the elegance of one's eventual mausoleum. But they were not weak. Driven by desperation and an insatiable will to escape their curse, the Necrontyr looked to the stars. In stasis ships wreathed in black metal, they left their world not to flee, but to conquer time and death through knowledge. They mastered sciences of terrifying scope, manipulating atoms, constructing artificial minds, crafting alloys that responded to thought. And yet, no matter how far they traveled, their curse lingered. Even under gentler suns, they still withered. Their bodies still failed them. And then they met the Old Ones. The exact moment of first contact is lost, whether it was a tentative envoy, a distant observation, or a fateful misunderstanding is debated among those few who know of it at all. But what matters is what followed: awe, envy, and fury. The Necrontyr beheld the Old Ones as living gods. Here were beings who had conquered age, who wandered the stars unending, untouched by the entropy that devoured Necrontyr youth. It is said the Necrontyr approached them as students at first, seeking the gift of longevity, perhaps even the knowledge to tame their star's deadly blessing. They were refused, whether it was pride, fear, or simple indifference that led the Old Ones to deny them. The result was the same. The Necrontyr, already racked by a legacy of pain, now had a focus for their hatred. The refusal stoked a fire that had long smoldered within their culture. They would not beg again. They would not ask. They would take. It is here that the earliest drums of the war in heaven begin to beat. Not yet with fleets, not yet with death, but with resentment so vast it would echo through eternity. The Necrontyr were not yet strong enough to face the Old Ones. Their empire was vast but fractious, ruled by countless dynasties in uneasy alliance under the Triarch, a three-member leadership crowned by the Silent King himself. The Old Ones, by contrast, held the warp in their grasp and could cross the stars in seconds, appearing and vanishing at will. The Necrontyr's envy deepened into obsession. They began to arm, to experiment with forbidden sciences, to prepare. The first sparks of war were small, skirmishes, border conflicts, a colony taken here or there. But with each act of defiance, the Necrontyr drew closer to unity under their grief. The Triarch began to speak of destiny, of vengeance, of reclaiming what had been stolen or denied. A species that had once only known mourning now rallied around the idea of conquest. This, then, was the birth of the war in heaven, not in fire, but in silence, not in armies, but in thought, in the long, grim halls of Necrontyr sepulchres, among the echoes of a people who had built a civilization around their own extinction. The idea of total war, of galactic vengeance, took root. And in the void, something listened, something ancient, something hungry. But that is a tale for another chapter. Let this be the first lesson, then. Before war can be fought, it must be felt. Before weapons are raised, hatred must take form. The war in heaven began not with the clash of fleets, but with the beating heart of a dying people who refused to go quietly into the dark. It was their defiance, raw, bitter, and absolute, that lit the first beacon of the oldest war. And though they did not yet know it, that beacon would blaze so bright it would burn gods from the sky and shatter time itself. They called themselves Necrontyr, sons and daughters of a dying world. Their name, once a lament, would soon become a curse, etched into the very bones of the galaxy. Where Chapter 1 glimpsed the shadows of the war in heaven, Chapter 2 leads us deeper into the abyss. This is not a tale of battles yet, nor of starfire raining down upon alien skies. This is a story of betrayal by the universe itself, of a people who, though they reached for the stars, could not outrun the noose tightening around their very biology. This is the story of the curse. The Necrontyr were born on a world orbiting a baleful, spiteful star. Even now, its name is lost to time. No records survive, nor do the Necrons care to remember it. They refer to it only in metaphor. The black sun, the morning star, the eternal pyre. It did not warm their world, it scorched it. Every breath they took was heavy with poison. Every moment under its light was a moment closer to decay. Radiation carved its legacy into their flesh before they were even born. Children entered the world with lesions, with tumors, with organs already failing. Their skin blistered beneath daylight. Their bones grew brittle with age before they had lived long enough to see the suns of other worlds. Death was not just a companion, it was a king, ever present, always hungering. They raged against it. It is perhaps one of the universe's cruelest ironies. The Necrontyr, of all species, were gifted with the minds to conquer the stars, but not the time to enjoy them. Their intellects were fierce, cold, brilliant. They discovered atomic theory before they discovered compassion. They built radiation shielding before they learned agriculture. They mastered the physics of propulsion, materials science, and energy harnessing faster than any species recorded in the galaxy's long chronicle. They built cities of obsidian and alloy, black towers like tombstones, across the harsh deserts of their homeworld. But for all their achievements, their lifespans remained pitifully short. A Necrontyr noble might rule a city-state for 2 or 3 decades before the lesions would take him, or the coughing blood began, or the nerves began to rot beneath the skin. Even the mightiest scientists, those whose genius reshaped the nature of metal and light, died screaming, their brains cooked alive by stellar poison. And so their culture turned inward, festering. Mourning became ritual, grief became architecture. The cities of the Necrontyr were more necropoli than metropoli, built not for the living but to exalt the dead. Grand sarcophagi dominated civic centers. Monuments to ancient kings loomed over the young, reminding them they would never match the glory of those already gone. Art, such as it was, celebrated entropy. Literature revolved around legacy, around being remembered rather than being happy. The Necrontyr had no time for joy, only meaning, only permanence, only revenge against an existence that mocked them. When the stars beckoned, they answered, not with wonder but with grim purpose. They forged generation ships, vast arc vessels that crawled across the void on plumes of plasma and gravitic propulsion. Colonists were locked in stasis for centuries at a time, their bodies frozen in silence, just to escape the deaths that their planet promised so freely. And escape they did. From their cursed cradle, they spread like a cancer across nearby systems. Colony worlds were established. Planet after planet became cloaked in the bleak signature of Necrontyr architecture. Angled black pylons, subterranean vaults, and living metal palaces that echoed with the coldness of their creators. Each new world was a bitter triumph. Every new star system was a battlefield, not against foes, but against their own gene rot and the long reach of radiation. They built domes, shields, towers that defied solar winds and storms, and still they died. The curse traveled with them. It was not the star, it was them. The truth began to sink into their highest circles. Their people were not merely victims of one malevolent sun. Their very blood had been marked. The radiation had not just burned their flesh, it had written itself into the fundamental code of their species. A scar across every strand of Necrontyr DNA. No matter how far they traveled, no matter how much science they bent to their will, they were prisoners of their own genome. This realization broke something within them. The diaspora fractured into dynasties, great families ruling vast sectors of space, each centered on a homeworld that mimicked the black architecture of their ancestors. But unity did not follow. Bitterness between dynasties flared. Accusations were hurled like meteorite volleys. One lineage had failed to develop a cure, another had hoarded technology, another had sabotaged a genetic research program. Wars of succession followed, cold, calculated, and ruinous. The galaxy burned with Necrontyr ambition, but never with hope. Seeing his people slide into self-destruction, one figure emerged to stop the bleeding. His name was Sarek, but history would only remember him as the Silent King. By ancient tradition, the Triarch ruled the Necrontyr, 3 High Lords elected from the strongest dynasties, forming a tripartite government that balanced power through consensus. Sarek sat as the High King among them, the supreme arbiter, but by sacred custom, he was never to speak directly to the people. He ruled through his 2 co-monarchs, who voiced his edicts and passed his judgment. It was a symbolic silence, meant to show that the king's will was pure and undistracted by mortal rhetoric. But in Sharek's case, it became a metaphor for something far deeper. He carried the weight of knowing that no decree, no law, no technological marvel could cure the rot in his people's souls. And yet he tried. He sought unity, not through conquest, but by promising a goal. A single distant star of hope in the blackened sky of Necrontyr despair. He promised them revenge, not against each other, not against fate, but against those who had denied them immortality, those who had watched them suffer and done nothing. The Old Ones. The first time the Necrontyr laid eyes upon the Old Ones, the effect was seismic. These beings strode through reality like titans. They did not die. They did not wither. They wielded powers that made the Necrontyr's finest accomplishments seem like toys carved by children. The Old Ones didn't just defy time. They barely acknowledged it. They were custodians of the galaxy, shaping evolution, uplifting species, crafting life as an artist shapes marble. And when the Necrontyr came to them, whether in peace or supplication, we may never know, the Old Ones said no. No knowledge of immortality would be shared, no genetic guidance, no redemption. It may have been apathy, or arrogance, or even a mercy, as some later Eldar historians speculate. Perhaps the Old Ones knew what the Necrontyr would become if granted eternity, but it didn't matter. The refusal lit a fire that Sharek fanned into a supernova. He rallied the dynasties. He ended the wars of secession. One by one, through diplomacy, bribes, threats, or surgical strikes, he brought the scattered Necrontyr under his rule. His two co-kings, bespeaking his silent fury, declared the formation of a unified Necrontyr empire, a final alliance against the injustices of the cosmos. They would no longer be victims of a dying sun. They would bring death to those who had cheated them of life. A people cursed, a dynasty forged in grief, now turned its eyes back to the stars, not as dreamers, not as scientists, but as executioners. The galaxy did not yet know it, but the oldest war in existence had just begun to stir. And the Necrontyr, those bitter children of a dying world, would soon make the stars themselves mourn. This was no longer the story of a species. It was the story of a vengeance that would echo across eternity. There comes a moment in every age where silence dies and war is born. The Necrontyr had suffered. That much is known. Their people had been forged in misery, tempered by the radiation of a murderous star, and scattered across the stars in grim determination. But all suffering, left too long to fester, ripens into hatred. And hatred, once nourished by time and bitterness, becomes more than a feeling. It becomes a weapon. At the heart of this turning point stood a figure shrouded in mystery and myth. Sharek, the Silent King. He did not shout his decrees, nor pound his fists upon war tables. His voice was carried by others, two co-rulers who spoke in his name, voices echoing like thunder from the lips of statues. But make no mistake, Sharek was not a puppet cloaked in ceremony. He was the mind behind the Necrontyr's vengeance, the architect of the greatest war the galaxy would ever endure. This was his war, and it began with a declaration not of conquest, but of defiance. Sharek had spent years unifying the shattered Necrontyr dynasties, each a viper's nest of power-hungry nobles, ancient bloodlines, and grudge-filled lords. He played the long game, maneuvering through threats and loyalties like a master strategist on a galactic scale. Every alliance formed, every rebellion crushed, was another stone in the foundation of something greater than vengeance. It was retribution written into the stars themselves. The Triarch was restored, not as a fragile council of competing egos, but as a war engine fueled by singular purpose. Szarek's vision, filtered through his silent will, became gospel, and at the heart of it was one goal: the extinction of the Old Ones. They were the target, the catalyst, the ones who had denied the Necrontyr immortality and spat upon their suffering. To the Silent King, this was not mere politics, it was a divine mandate. In his mind, the Old Ones had failed the galaxy by hoarding power, by playing God with the destinies of lesser species. The Necrontyr would correct that failure with fire. But they did not march into war blindly. Zarek, for all his fury, was a patient king. He knew the Old Ones were not merely advanced, they were masters of the material and the immaterial. Their dominion stretched across time and space through the webway, a vast network of hidden tunnels that bypassed the constraints of reality. Their cities floated like dreams among stars. Their minds moved in ways that bent probability and altered fate. You could not simply fight such beings, you had to outthink them. And so the Necrontyr began to prepare in earnest. They built, across 1,000 worlds, forged cities awakened. Planetary crusts were hollowed out to house weapons the likes of which had never been seen. Celestial engines turned neutronium and living metal into fleets of black ships that pulsed with barely contained power. In the deep cold of interstellar space, they tested weapons on rogue moons, like catapults that could shear the crust from a planet, stellar disruptors that could coax a sun into premature nova. But weapons alone would not win them the war. The Old Ones had knowledge the Necrontyr could barely fathom. It was said they could unmake matter with thought, that their minds could strike like lightning through the warp, shaping the battlefield from light years away. They never needed to fight fair. They never had to fight at all. Which is why Zarek understood. If the Necrontyr were to win, they must change the rules of the game. One of the first acts of the Triarch was to outlaw all future contact with the Old Ones under terms of peace. Any emissary found dealing with them was to be executed without trial. Diplomacy was dead. In its place came espionage. Necrontyr scientists and engineers began to reverse engineer what little they could scavenge from encounters with the Old Ones. Fragmented technology recovered from border skirmishes was pulled apart atom by atom. In tomb vault laboratories, grotesque test chambers simulated psychic energy flows, and though the Necrontyr lacked true psychic potential, another curse of their genetic legacy, they began to develop countermeasures. Fields that disrupted warp echoes, materials that absorbed empiric fluctuations, devices that could sever a psyker's mind from the immaterium like a blade cutting nerve from spine. The most ambitious project of all was the Null Matrix, a colossal grid of pylons that could, in theory, dampen the warp itself across entire systems. The theories were arcane, the mechanisms volatile, and the risks enormous. But Zarek approved it instantly. It was their edge. If the Necrontyr could not wield the warp, they would simply erase it from the battlefield. Meanwhile, the war machine was growing restless. The dynasties, now partially unified, demanded blood. The nobles chafed against theory and planning. They wanted glory, deeds to carve into their tomb walls, worlds to raise in their ancestors' names. And so Zarek gave them what they desired. The first true assaults began on the frontier. These were not grand invasions, but surgical strikes, blows meant to test the Old Ones' defenses and draw out their tactics. Necrontyr warships, shaped like blades and clad in radiation-scarred alloy, descended upon life-seeded planets with brutal precision. Automated warforms struck like lightning, harvesting data as they killed. Observatories were turned into glass, psychic outposts reduced to charred craters. And then the Necrontyr vanished. The Old Ones responded with predictable fury. They retaliated, striking at Necrontyr colonies with psionic storms and warp-born beasts conjured from the immaterium. But the damage had been done. The war had begun in earnest. Yet the Necrontyr were not prepared for what came next. As the battles escalated, Zarek realized the true scope of the enemy he had chosen. The Old Ones did not merely fight, they flowed. Their movements through the webway made their armies unpredictable. Their creations, biological constructs crafted to be psychic soldiers, fought with savagery and intelligence. These weren't mindless brutes. They were tailored weapons, evolved in vats of godlike design. Each battlefield was a crucible where the Necrontyr were outmaneuvered, not just by strength, but by time and space itself. Even victories came at terrible cost. Necrontyr commanders began reporting losses they could not explain. Ships vanishing mid-jump, entire regiments driven mad by unseen forces, weapons melting into slag under pressures the engineers swore were impossible. The Old Ones weren't just winning, they were playing a different reality. Zarek did not flinch, he did not rant or punish his generals. Instead, he studied. Every loss was catalogued, every mystery dissected. He grew quiet, colder than ever, disappearing for years at a time into sealed laboratories, forbidden fortresses where alien materials were studied and terrible prototypes were tested. He was not merely fighting a war, he was building a solution. And it was during this time, deep in the shadow of mounting defeat, when even the dynasties began to waver again, that something changed. The stars whispered. Ancient signals, previously dismissed as cosmic background noise, revealed hidden patterns. Scans of dying suns began returning anomalous readings, energy signatures that did not match any known source. Deep space augurs, when aligned just so, picked up hunger, a kind of living intelligence coiled in stellar furnaces, dormant and watching. The Silent King listened. The galaxy, as always, held its secrets in fire, and Zarek, in his silent brilliance, heard the call of something older than hate, something not of flesh, nor time, nor even matter, something that might not only win the war, but end the curse. And for the first time since the war began, Zarek smiled, not with his mouth, of course, but with his plans. The war with the Old Ones was not going well. The Necrontyr were brilliant but finite. The Old Ones were masters of infinity. Zarek had reached the ceiling of what his empire could accomplish alone. It was time to find allies, but not among the living, among the stars. The true beginning of the war in heaven was not marked by a shot or a strike, but by a realization that to defeat the gods of old, the Necrontyr would need to awaken something even older. And the stars were listening, waiting to be fed. Before the gods bled, they hungered. Long before they were shattered into shards and sealed in cages of impossible metal, long before they were called Catan by trembling Necrontyr priests, they existed as whispers in the burning hearts of stars. They were not born, for nothing truly births a god. They were formed slowly, like frost on a window pane. Not of flesh nor of mind, but of energy, pure, radiant, impossible energy. Consciousness without matter, desire without form. They were the first predators. As the young galaxy spun in silence, they drifted unseen among the stellar crucibles. Where suns flared too bright, they lingered. Where stars collapsed, they mourned, if mourning can be assigned to such things. They did not speak. They did not sleep. They fed, not on flesh, not on blood, but on light, on radiance, on the cosmic breath of fusion. For eons beyond counting, they drifted in solitude, sated only by the distant glow of their stellar feast, alone, dormant, dreaming. And then something called to them. It wasn't prayer, not yet, nor was it sacrifice. It was rage. Somewhere in the cold dark between systems, something new stirred. A frequency began to echo through the stars, not a sound but a pattern, bitter, cold, relentless. It was the psychic weight of an entire species screaming into the void, not in fear, but in fury. A trillion voices, all shouting without tongues, burned with a shared hatred so powerful it warped space itself. The Necrontyr had begun their war against the Old Ones, and their suffering called out across the firmament. The beings that would come to be known as the Citan heard that cry. It pierced the veil of fusion fire and gravity that bound them to their silent, half-sentient existence. It woke them. For the first time, they felt something more than hunger. They felt curiosity. Drawn to the strange resonance of sentient thought, they moved. Slowly, impossibly slowly. Gods are not creatures of haste. They slid between solar winds and radiation belts, slipping into the physical realm. Like sharks following the scent of blood in dark waters, they found themselves pulled not toward life, but toward pain. They found the Necrontyr, and the Necrontyr, in their desperation, found them. It began as a mystery. Across Necrontyr space, observatories began registering anomalies, solar flares behaving with unnatural rhythm, neutrino emissions oscillating in patterns that mimicked language. Strange humming harmonics began to emerge in the radiation output of certain stars. It was as if the suns themselves had begun to speak. Zarek, the Silent King, watched these phenomena with the stillness of a predator. He knew this was no natural event, and unlike many in his court, he did not see a threat. He saw an invitation. It is recorded in fragmentary tomb mnemonics that the first direct encounter came near a dying red supergiant on the edge of the halo stars. A Necrontyr research vessel, dispatched to investigate the strange energy anomalies, vanished from reality for 3 minutes and 49 seconds. When it reappeared, it bore a mark on its hull, a vast swirling sigil of burned metal in a pattern no Necrontyr had ever seen. Every crew member was dead, their bodies untouched, but their minds hollowed out. One survivor, its brain protected within a cryo-circuit stasis shell, was revived for interrogation. It spoke one phrase before self-destructing. "They are awake." From that moment, contact was inevitable. The Citan had no need for ships or bodies. They drifted across star systems like ghosts through dreams. But the Necrontyr, craving to understand and to wield this newfound power, sought a means to bring them into form. It was a high cryptech of the Zarakan dynasty, unnamed in any surviving record, who proposed the heresy to offer the Citan bodies, forms of necrodermis, the living metal that could shape itself to thought and will. If such constructs could be forged and offered, perhaps the star gods would enter them. Perhaps they would become manifest. Perhaps they could be used. Zarek, ever the tactician, gave his approval. Across Necrontyr space, vast crucibles were built. From the forges of Mandragora to the starlit vaults of Sarnutus, the Necrontyr poured rivers of molten necrodermis into humanoid molds, towering, terrible silhouettes that seemed half statue, half deity. Glyphs of invitation were etched into their frames. Stellar resonance was embedded in their cores. They were not weapons. They were thrones. And into them came the Citan. No two entered alike. Some slithered from the hearts of stars as ribbons of searing light, wrapping themselves around the waiting necrodermis like lovers embracing long-lost forms. Others struck like thunderbolts, cracking reality as they forced themselves into metal flesh. And some simply appeared, one moment absent, the next present, their arrival heralded only by a sense of wrongness, of silence too thick to breathe. Each became something new, a god-given body, a star-given voice. The Necrontyr called them Citan, star gods, and for a time it seemed they had chosen wisely. The Citan brought wonders. They opened realms of physics the Necrontyr had only theorized. They taught secrets of power transmission, of instantaneous movement through space, of weaponry that could unmake molecules. Where the old ones had hoarded their wisdom, the Citan offered gifts freely. They asked only one thing in return: obedience. Not servitude, not worship, though many gave both, but acceptance. The Citan claimed dominion over the stars. The Necrontyr need only let them rule. And Sarek, seeing the tide of the war turning, agreed. The Silent King made a proclamation, carried across the stars by quantum pulse. The Necrontyr would no longer fight alone. Their gods had come. The war against the Old Ones would be renewed with divine fire, and those who had once looked down on the Necrontyr would now be consumed by their wrath and by the hunger of the gods. But as the Necrontyr celebrated, a few wondered. The Citan had brought power, yes, but power always demands a price. And the more the Necrontyr studied their gods, the more they realized these were not benevolent entities. They were predators. A Necrontyr priest-scientist, one of the last to resist full devotion to the New Order, recorded a single phrase in his data scroll before he vanished. They do not serve, they feed. But it was too late. The Citan had already begun to whisper promises of immortality. They would cure the Necrontyr's curse. They would sever death from destiny. They would offer what the Old Ones had denied. All that was required was transformation. And Sarek, the Silent King, stared into the burning eyes of gods and saw his people's salvation reflected in their hungry gaze. This was no longer a war of species, it was a war of gods, and the Necrontyr at last had chosen theirs. The stars themselves trembled, not from fear, but from anticipation. The banquet was about to begin. There are pacts written in ink, some in blood, but the deadliest are written in silence, agreed to not with words, but with the weariness of a broken soul. The Necrontyr, shattered by suffering, had asked for immortality. The Citan, hungering for more than light, had offered it. Now the price would be paid, not in coin, not in conquest, but in flesh. The Citan came bearing a promise, the answer to the Necrontyr's ancient curse. No more frail bodies, no more cells decaying under a merciless sun. They would be reborn, not as they were, but as something greater, undying, unchanging, immutable. At first, the idea was met with awe. The priests of the dynasties declared its salvation. Generals saw the strategic potential, soldiers who could not age, could not feel pain, who could march through radiation storms and starfire unscathed. Sarek, the Silent King, approved the first trials without hesitation. If this transformation worked, even partially, the Necrontyr could reclaim their future from the grave. The process would come to be known as biotransference. No living being had ever attempted what the Citan proposed. The Necrontyr would be stripped of their organic forms. Their consciousness, their very essence, would be surgically transferred into vessels of necrodermis, bodies of living metal, sculpted to suit each function. Warriors would become killing machines. Scientists would become floating intellect nodes. Leaders would be reborn as towering monuments of authority and code. And the soul, the spirit? The Citan did not speak of such things, but they smiled. The first to undergo the procedure were volunteers, patriotic, eager, desperate. High lords and elite warriors, proud to lead the way into a new age. They were marched into the furnaces like emperors into a coronation. Music played. Flags were raised. When they emerged, the music stopped. The bodies that came forth were beautiful in their way, gleaming, regal, radiant with internal light. Stronger than any organic form, agile, tireless, immune to pain, to weakness, to hunger. In every measurable way, they were perfect. But when they spoke, something was wrong. Their words were stilted, cold, stripped of cadence. Their laughter had been replaced with a kind of mechanical buzzing. Their eyes, if they still had them, no longer sparkled. They stared straight ahead, unblinking. Many assumed it was temporary. an effect of trauma or adjustment. But as more underwent the procedure, a pattern became clear. Yes, the bodies endured, but the person within did not, or at least not all of it. The soul, it seemed, could not survive the transfer intact. What emerged from the crucibles of biotransference were not simply mechanical versions of their former selves. They were echoes, reflections, ghosts trapped in brass and steel. The cryptechs, those scientists responsible for overseeing the process, soon began to notice errors. The consciousness of the subjects was sometimes fragmented, dulled, or overwritten. Memories bled away, personalities dissolved. In many cases, only basic operational programming remained. These were not minds. These were protocols. The Citan, for their part, did nothing to stop it, because this had been their intent all along. Biotransference was never a gift. It was a harvest. Each time a Necrontyr's soul was torn from flesh and cast into a necrodermis shell, the essence that was stripped away, the pain, the fear, the life, was consumed, devoured. The Citan, in their radiant hunger, fed not only on the stars, but on souls. And now the Necrontyr were delivering them by the billions. Zarek watched as the truth unfolded. He had not been the first into the furnaces, but he was among the early wave. When he emerged, his new form was majestic, unbreakable, eternal. But he knew immediately that something had changed. It wasn't pain. There was no pain anymore. It was the absence of everything else. No warmth, no joy, no sorrow. Even memory itself felt distant, like reading someone else's biography. He could recall his people's history. He could quote their great philosophers, but he no longer felt connected to any of it. He looked out across the processing fields of Mandragora and saw a civilization reduced to a production line. Millions of his people marched silently into the furnaces. None resisted. Why would they? This was what they had begged for, and one by one they were hollowed out. Some retained more than others. The high nobles, those of strong will or fortified minds, kept their memories, at least in part. The greatest generals, the most willful lords, emerged as twisted versions of their old selves, angry, resentful, half-mad with what they had lost. But the vast majority of the Necrontyr became functionaries, automatons programmed for duty. They were no longer a race. They were a mechanism. The Necrontyr in body were gone. The Necrons had risen, and their gods grew fat. The Citan reveled in the torrent of soul energy. They drank the agony like vintage wine, basking in the ecstasy of spiritual consumption. Some even grew stronger, warping the very laws of physics around them, becoming more and more monstrous in shape and appetite. The deceiver laughed loudest of all. He had been the one to first approach Zarek, whispering of immortality and unity. It was he who planted the seed of biotransference, cloaked in promises and false empathy. And now, with the Necrontyr's transformation complete, he revealed his true face, that of a liar god, a trickster born not of mischief, but of annihilation. Zarek said nothing. He watched his people transformed. He watched their souls fed to monsters, and he remembered. He did not rage. He did not strike. Not yet. The war against the old ones still burned across the stars. With their new forms, the Necrons were more powerful than ever. They required no rest, no food, no supply lines. They could teleport into battle, shrug off mortal wounds, and obey command hierarchies with machine-like precision. The tide of war was about to turn. But at what cost? The silent king, in his heart of necrodermis, understood the magnitude of what he had done. His people had been saved from death, but not from damnation. He had bartered their souls for victory. And worse, it had worked. This was the price of eternity. And there would be no refund. In later epochs, when the Necrons would slumber beneath the sands of forgotten tomb worlds, and when strange races like man would walk beneath unfamiliar skies, a faint psychic echo would still linger in the fabric of the galaxy. Not words, not warning, just a feeling, cold, empty, unyielding. It is the aftertaste of the Necrontyr's choice, the consequence of their bargain. Immortality was granted, but everything that made them alive was burned in the fire, and the gods had feasted well. The stars bled, not metaphorically, not as poetry. The stars, those sacred ancient furnaces that once nourished worlds and beckoned sailors from 100 cultures, were torn open, drained, devoured. The Citan had finished their feast. They had gorged on the souls of an entire species, a billion-fold death that echoed through the warp like a silent scream. But the soul harvest had merely been an appetizer. The real hunger still burned within them, and now that they had bodies, terrible necrodermis shells of living metal shaped by the Necrontyr as vessels for godhood, they turned their gaze outward. The galaxy awaited. Zarek, the Silent King, stood at the head of a new empire. His Necrontyr people were gone, twisted into the cold, undying legions of the Necrons. The Citan, whom many still revered as gods, despite the growing dread in their presence, now walked among the stars as living cataclysms. And before them lay the oldest enemy, the Old Ones. The war in heaven truly began now, not in secret laboratories or whispered alliances, but in fire and annihilation. It would no longer be fought in the shadows of frontier worlds. This would be a war of extermination. One side would not survive. The first true campaign was launched from the star fortress of Cronus, where a Citan named Nyadra Zath, the Burning One, ignited 3 suns into premature nova with a mere thought. Each housed Old One enclaves, webway junctions, and dozens of lesser species under their protection. All gone, in minutes. The Necrons followed in his wake, immortal foot soldiers marching in formation, teleporting between planetary strongholds via dolmen gates, new conduits carved through the veil of reality itself. While the Old Ones had the webway, the Necrons were not limited by flesh or exhaustion. They moved like a virus, coordinated with perfect machine logic. No hunger, no sleep, no mercy. It was slaughter, but it was not chaos. The Necrons were precise, surgical, mathematical in their eradication. A planet's biosphere would be mapped within minutes of arrival. Population centers targeted, resistance cataloged, defensive measures neutralized. There was no negotiation, no broadcast of intent. Where they landed, life stopped. Not by disease or fire or famine, but by pure and deliberate subtraction. The Old Ones responded as only they could. With brilliance, they redirected their psychic mastery to create new species, tools, weapons, children, biological constructs bred in star vaults and grown in decades where evolution would take millennia. Some were graceful and deadly, early prototypes of the Eldar, gifted with immense psychic potential and preternatural grace. Others were brute enforcers, walking engines of destruction formed from fungus and war spores, the precursors of what we now call orcs. Each was seeded on dozens of worlds, each trained in secret to counter the Necron threat. The Old Ones had once sought to guide the galaxy. Now they would weaponize it. But even their genius could not anticipate the horror to come. The Citan were not like any foe the Old Ones had known. They could not be reasoned with, bribed, or manipulated. They were not mortal. They were principles of reality made manifest, beings of heat, entropy, deception, gravity. Each had taken a name, but none had taken limits, and they did not wage war for survival. They waged it for hunger. There is a record, though fragmented, in a damaged data core retrieved from the ruins of Elos Prime, an Old One stronghold. We had thought them mere constructs. Now we see the truth. They are the scream beneath the surface of creation. They do not conquer. They do not even hate. They devour. The worst of them was the Nightbringer. Before it bore that name, it had drifted within the hearts of black stars, unseen and incomprehensible. Now, wrapped in necrodermis, it walked, towering, cloaked in shadows no sun could pierce. When it arrived, entire planetary populations fell into catatonia before a single shot was fired. Their souls pulled from their bodies like threads from silk. This Citan brought death, not as a state of being, but as a presence, an awareness. Every living thing in its path experienced the concept of mortality as a sentient force. The very idea of endings became alive, and it wore a blade of starlight. Even the other Citan feared it, and that, perhaps more than anything, speaks to its power. The old ones, in desperation, enacted new strategies. They deployed warp storms, weaponized the immaterium itself, and summoned great psychic tempests to shield their last sanctuaries. But the Necrons were tireless. The Citan were unstoppable. In those days, stars died screaming. Solar systems that had nurtured life for billions of years were unmade in hours. Moons shattered, time distorted. In some instances, entire regions of space were severed from the materium, left to drift in null dimensions where even light would not follow. And yet, the old ones endured. They had ruled the galaxy for longer than time could remember. They knew secrets the Necrons could not fathom, and they had faith, not in gods, but in their creations. The young races, they poured everything into them. Eldar war hosts, bearing weapons of psychic crystal and channeled starlight, began to push back. The Krork, what would one day be the Orcs, rose in vast hordes, charging into battle with joy and abandon, impervious to fear, their minds echoing with ancestral programming that screamed one word over and over: war. The tide briefly shifted. For the first time, the Necrons experienced retreat. Not defeat, never defeat, but disruption. They had not expected resistance so sudden, so adaptable. The Citan, eternal and unchanging, sneered at this new challenge. But among the Necron High Command, concern flickered. Sarek watched it all unfold with mechanical calm. Victory was still within reach. The Citan had weakened the old ones beyond repair. But the longer the war dragged, the more Sarek began to understand a second, darker truth. The Citan were not allies. They were tyrants, parasites, wielding the Necrons like tools and feeding upon the very life the Necrons fought to extinguish. Each battle was a banquet, every lost soul another sip of strength, and they had no intention of stopping. Already, Citan began turning on one another. Some grew jealous, others grew mad. One attempted to devour a star where another had nested. Two clashed above the ruins of Vontal, tearing holes in reality that still haven't sealed. Their war was not over the galaxy. It was over who would own it once it was empty. Sarek saw it, and quietly he began to plan. The Necrons had been forged into perfect warriors. They no longer feared death. But Zarek, now hollow and eternally lucid, feared something worse: irrelevance. His people had been transformed into the instruments of cosmic predators. What was the point of a species that could conquer the stars, only to be slaves in a lifeless universe ruled by insatiable gods? Number this would not stand. The Silent King began gathering his mightiest cryptex. In secret, beneath tomb worlds untouched by the war, they built new weapons, not to fight the old ones, but to slay the Citan. The heavens had been butchered, but the butchers would bleed. Not yet, not now, but soon. Zarek was silent, but his war was not over. The war had become something else. It was no longer a conflict between rival powers or competing civilizations. It was a wound, ripped into the fabric of the galaxy, festering, infected, and spreading. For the Necrons, it was a triumph twisted into a mockery. For the Satan, it was a feeding frenzy spiraling into madness. But for the Old Ones, it was survival. They had ruled for millions of years, not with empires of tyranny, but with a subtle hand, guiding, planting, uplifting. They had sown the seeds of sentient life across the stars, tending to civilizations as a gardener might to a grove. In their long, near-immortal lives, they had seen stars born and die, races rise and fall. The pulse of the cosmos beat in time with their wisdom. They were the shepherds of the galaxy. But even shepherds can be overrun by wolves. The Necron onslaught had driven the Old Ones into retreat. Their psychic mastery, their control of the webway, their genetic ingenuity. It had not been enough. Against the tireless march of machine warriors and the cosmic butchery of the Satan, the Old Ones could not hold the line. Their once thriving civilization collapsed into defense perimeters and hidden sanctuaries. Worlds they had sculpted into paradises were reduced to dust, their guardian species torn apart or consumed. But if there was one thing the Old Ones understood, it was adaptation. The Necrons had given up their biology. They had become timeless engines of order and death. And the Satan, in their divine arrogance, were immutable, unable to comprehend change or chaos. But the Old Ones, they could evolve. More importantly, they could create. It was not the first time they had made new life. That had been their legacy, forming entire species to carry out tasks, defend realms, inherit the future. But now, under pressure unlike any before, they turned their mastery of genetics and the warp toward one last effort. Not to save themselves, but to ensure the Necrons would never rule unchallenged. They called it the Genesis Protocol. Across forgotten stars and hidden laboratories buried deep within asteroid cores, the Old Ones activated biogenesis systems older than most stars. They created new species, crafted not over millennia but in weeks. And these were not peaceful emissaries. These were not slow-burning projects of education and guidance. These were weapons. The first were the Eldari, what we now call the Eldar. Tall, graceful, agile, gifted with powerful minds and psychic potential deeper than any known species. They were not bred for brute strength, but for understanding, for strategy, for intuition. The Eldari were attuned to the warp in a way even the Old Ones had not fully foreseen. They became not just soldiers, but architects of resistance. Their connection to the immaterium allowed them to see probability, to weave outcomes, to feel the shape of destiny. Where Necrons moved like rigid lines of code, the Eldari moved like music. They could not match the Necrons in durability. Few could, but they could anticipate, evade, strike from where the Necrons least expected, then vanish like smoke into the webway. The Old Ones taught them, honed them. Within centuries, the Eldari were commanding fleets, coordinating galactic counterstrikes, dismantling Necron campaigns with precision. But they were not alone. The Old Ones also gave form to a cruder, more savage answer to the Necron threat. The Krork, not the Orcs as we know them now, laughing brutes in ramshackle armor, but their ancestors. Towering war giants, driven by embedded psychic programming, bred to thrive on violence and to resist decay, radiation, and mind control. They did not think, they fought. Built not with subtlety, but with purpose. The Krork were the blunt hammer to the Eldari's scalpel. Where Eldari danced between time and perception, the Krork crashed through Necron lines like a green tidal wave. There are accounts, rare and fragmented, of entire Necron battle lines broken under Krork assault. Not because they lacked strength, but because the Krork never stopped. Their momentum defied calculation. Their presence on a battlefield caused disruptions in Necron command protocols. Logic couldn't predict madness. Order could not compute war for war's sake. And the Krork loved war. The galaxy, once dominated by the binary confrontation between Necron and Old One, fractured into 1,000 fronts. The Eldari took up hidden weapons and struck from the webway, slicing at the heart of the Necron supply grid. The Krork fell from the stars in crude but effective asteroid hulks, slamming into planets like angry gods and tearing apart tomb complexes by sheer mass and fury. Even the lesser species, those seeded long ago, began to stir. The Jokero, the Kinib, countless other gene lines spread across forgotten systems, responded to ancestral awakenings embedded in their DNA. Many failed, some vanished, but a few, just a few, fought back. The Necrons were not used to this. They had expected extinction to be simple. And for a time it had been. Now the prey had teeth. Sarek watched the battlefield data streams with increasing unease. Logic dictated they should still be winning. The Necron war machine was vast, tireless, coordinated. The Citan were gods, but the tide was shifting, slowly, subtly. These younger species were unpredictable. They changed, they adapted. The Krork multiplied rapidly, even when culled. The Eldari began developing new psychic techniques, ones that bent the warp in novel ways even the Citan began to feel. The Necrons had the galaxy in their grip, but it was slipping. Even the Citan, who had once regarded the young races as gnats, began to grow agitated. Warp energies were poisonous to them. As the Eldari learned to weaponize raw emotion and probability, the Citan found their immortal forms assailed in ways they could not counter. Their arrogance turned to impatience. They began to demand purges, wide-scale annihilations, even when Sharek counseled restraint. The Silent King saw what was coming, a new balance, a new age. The old ones, crippled, scattered, still had one last victory. They had changed the war. And Zarek understood a terrible truth. He had led his people into eternity, but others were learning to shape the future. He was locked in amber. They were evolving, and evolution always wins. This was not the final blow. Not yet, but it was the beginning of the Necron downfall. The first cracks in the tomb walls, the first whispers that not even gods could remain unchallenged forever. The stars, once butchered, now began to fight back, not through vengeance, but through life. It began with a ripple, not in water or air, but in reality itself. A tremor, soft and slow, passed through the invisible skein that separated the material world from what lay beneath. A twitch in the fabric of the universe, as if existence had flinched. At first, no one noticed. Not even the Citan, so sure of their dominion over the physical. Not the Necrons, whose minds now existed as organized data, immune to instinct or intuition. Not even the old ones, who had danced along the borders of that other realm for countless ages, ever wary of its currents. But the Eldari noticed, or more precisely, felt it. It came in dreams at first, faint whispers in their sleep, songs with no melody, colors without form. Children screamed at night, unable to explain why. Seers began to lose focus. Scryers looked too long into the future and wept blood. Something was growing, something new, or perhaps something old, waking up. It had no name, but we know it now as the Warp, not the Immaterium as a passive backdrop, an infinite sea of potential and psychic flow, but the Warp as a force, as a thing that could hate, love, hunger, twist, lie, exist. It had always been there, of course, just beneath the skin of the galaxy, responding to the emotions of sentient beings. The Warp was shaped by thought, fed by dreams and fears, given texture by rage and sorrow. For millions of years it had remained largely calm, a vast, still ocean. But war, as it always does, changes things. And this war, the war in heaven, was not just any conflict. It was annihilation made endless. The Necrons' soulless slaughter, the Satan's ravenous consumption, the desperation of the Old Ones, the psychic evolution of the Eldari, the mindless fury of the Krork. All of it spilled into the warp. Every death, every scream, every hope snuffed out or vow of vengeance sworn, it all had weight. And the warp began to boil. Where once the immaterium had shimmered with potential, it now churned with chaos. Thought became storm. Emotion became entity. Psychic energy condensed into awareness. New life took form, not in the stars, but beneath them. The warp was not just reacting, it was becoming. Across the galaxy, things began to go wrong. Warp gates, once used by the Old Ones, began to rupture. Portals meant to link world to world now disgorged madness. Entire planets vanished, swallowed whole by screaming rifts of unreality. Ships passing through safe transit zones arrived centuries later, or never at all. Time fractured, logic failed, and something else arrived. Not creatures, not quite, not like anything the Old Ones had bred or fought. These were not life forms born of matter. They were thoughts turned into weapons, instincts with fangs, predators of soul stuff, shaped by the tides of fear, wrath, excess, despair. They would later be called warp entities, or more simply, demons. They had no true shape. They wore the faces of what terrified those who saw them. For some, they appeared as gods. For others, as shadows, serpents, lovers, flames. Their forms shifted like Mercury in a dream. And they came not to conquer, but to consume, to feed on the galaxy's pain. And it was so very hungry. The Old Ones were the first to recognize the signs. They had long used the warp as a tool, channeling its energies to manipulate biology, to travel vast distances, to power their technologies. But now they recoiled. The thing they had once bent to their will now surged with wrath. It was no longer a placid river, it was a tidal wave. They attempted to close the gates. Many succeeded, some did not. Where they failed, nightmares poured through. Eldar strongholds, previously untouchable, were overrun, not by Necron phalanxes or Citan avatars, but by dreams turned hostile. Entire cities were emptied in minutes. Not a single body was found. Only murals of weeping faces burned into the walls, and echoes of laughter that never ended. The Krork fared better at first. Their minds were blunt, their thoughts primal. The warp found little nourishment in their simplistic emotions. But over time, even they began to change. Some grew larger, meaner, more erratic. Their psyker leaders, the Weird Boys, began exploding without cause, their heads erupting into clouds of raw psychic force. The Krork did not fear the warp, but the warp did not need fear. Rage was enough. Zarek, watching from his tomb throne, saw the signs. His cryptex observed the anomalies. The dolmen gates, constructed by Necron science to pierce the veil, began registering resistance, unnatural friction, howls in the data streams. Something was pushing back from the other side. The Silent King understood the terrible irony. The Necrons had sought to eliminate all life, to still the galaxy's beating heart. But in doing so, they had fed a greater beast. They had poured so much death into the void that the void had become alive, and it was not theirs to control. The Citan, too, began to feel it. They had long dismissed the warp as an inferior realm, a place of instability and weakness. Now it clawed at their necrodermis shells, not with physical force, but with meaning. The Citan were unchanging, eternal, but the warp was possibility made real. And possibility, when shaped by agony and madness, is more dangerous than any blade. In one recorded event, the Satan known as Azagorth, the infinite coil attempted to consume a psychic storm. It had grown arrogant. believing itself able to devour the energy as it had devoured stars. What emerged from the vortex was not Azagorth, but something wearing pieces of its form like a cloak. It laughed with 1,000 voices, and then it vanished, dragging a third of a star system with it. Zarek, who had once led his people into the arms of gods, now watched as those gods faltered. The galaxy had become a three-front war: the Necrons and their star gods, the Old Ones and their creations, and now the warp itself. The Immaterium had no generals, no leaders, but it had purpose. It would unmake what had been made. The Old Ones, in a last act of desperation, began to isolate their remaining realms. They severed their webway from the Materium. They built psychic dampeners, early versions of the Blackstone pylons we know today. They knew now what they had unleashed, and they sought to contain it. But it was too late. The warp was loose, not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough to tear open the sky and let madness rain down. This was the price of the war in heaven. Not merely death, but unreality. The Necrons had tried to silence the stars, the Old Ones had tried to defend them, and in the end, all their efforts only served to wake the dark beneath creation. What came next? Would not care who fired first. The warp does not forget, and now it had begun to dream aloud. Not all monsters come from the stars, some come from inside you. Even as gods bled in the void and empires crumbled to ash, it was not a weapon of Necron origin, nor a demon forged of raw warp that would bring the galaxy to its knees. No vast war host or ancient intelligence could match the devastation of what would come next. No one summoned them. No one welcomed them. They simply arrived, because the veil had thinned, because the screams of dying worlds had grown too loud to ignore, because a galaxy drowning in pain had become too rich to resist. They are known by many names. The Eldari call them Inariath. To ancient Xenos archivists, they were psychivores. To some, they are just the darkness between. But to imperial scholars who piece together the horror from scattered ruins and forbidden texts, they are called the Enslavers. And in the twilight of the war in heaven, they brought the curtain crashing down. It began as a whisper. On hundreds of worlds, seers and psychers suddenly went silent, then erupted into screams. Across the starways, those attuned to the warp began to claw at their own eyes. Reports from the surviving Old Ones spoke of psychics being overwhelmed by visions of tendrils, not physical, but emotional, feelings that squeezed, corrupted, coiled around thought, and rewrote it. The enslavers didn't arrive through ships or gates. They seeped in like infection through a wound. The Immaterium had been disturbed beyond its capacity to remain silent. The raw, emotional hemorrhaging of the war in heaven had stirred up psychic resonance across the galaxy. All at once, an interconnected web of thought had lit up like a neural flare, bright, hot, and visible from the other side of reality. The enslavers saw it. They followed the light, and they began to feed. They are not what we think of when we imagine enemies. They have no armies, no warships, no machines. They are not conquerors. They are parasitic intelligences. They drift through the warp like jellyfish through a sea of madness, sensing, waiting, hungering for minds to touch. When they find one, a bright enough beacon, a psychic burning hot with fear or power, they latch on. From the other side of reality, they reach through the psycher's soul like a hand through gauze, and then they pull. The psychic is transformed into a portal, not a metaphorical one, but a living gate, their flesh twisted into a tunnel through which the enslavers pour into the material realm. Once through, the enslavers do not destroy. That would be inefficient. They dominate. Their influence is total. They don't just control minds. They unravel them and rewrite them with alien code. Victims become puppets, no longer people, but extensions of the enslaver's will. Whole populations fell in hours. Entire cities marched themselves into the sea or tore each other apart with hands and teeth, all with serene smiles and blank, glowing eyes. A single enslaver could corrupt a world, and there were millions. The Old Ones were the first to understand the scale of the threat, and they despaired. Their once proud creations, those races they had uplifted and gifted with psychic mastery, had become beacons for the invasion. Every brilliant Aeldari mind, every furious Krork shaman, every warp-sensitive species they had designed to resist the Necron tide had become a liability. Their weapons had become doors. And so the Old Ones turned to the unthinkable. They began to cull their own creations. Some were euthanized in sleep. Others were wiped out with viral bombs or solar flares. On one world, Zerut Prime, they lured a Krork warband into a sealed dome with promises of weapons, then collapsed the dome into a black hole. But it wasn't enough. The infection had spread too far. The enslavers were inside. For the Necrons, the horror was different. They were immune to the enslavers' domination, soulless, emotionless machines with no minds to corrupt or spirits to grasp. To the enslavers, they were flavorless, unappetizing, and so they were ignored. At first, this should have been a gift. Instead, it became a curse, because now the Necrons stood alone. No prey, no war, just a galaxy being emptied, one screaming mind at a time. They watched from their tomb worlds and command monoliths as the young races they had once hunted began to disintegrate. Not from battle, but from inside. There were no triumphs, no parades, no final victory. Just silence. What the Citan had failed to do with all their godlike might, the enslavers accomplished without firing a shot. They were not part of any plan. They were the consequence of it. The psychic backlash of the war in heaven had opened a rift that could not be closed. The immaterium, once manipulated with surgical precision by the Old Ones, was now an uncontrolled ocean, and in that ocean swam sharks without end. The Aeldari, once poised to inherit the galaxy, were brought to their knees. Their elegant minds, so attuned, so vivid, made them the choicest prey. Whole craft worlds went dark. Webway cities collapsed as psychic nexuses became nests for enslaver broods. Eldari psychers tore themselves apart trying to protect their kin. Many simply vanished, absorbed into the portals their deaths opened. Some fought back. They learned to shield their minds, to mask their presence with rituals and artificial calm. Eldari warlocks created soulstone amulets to keep their spirits from being consumed, and exodite colonies fled into the webway or far-off garden worlds. But their golden age was over before it began. The enslavers had seen them, and the warp remembers. The Krork resisted differently, not with subtlety but with brutality. They responded to possession by smashing their own heads into walls, by tearing apart their psychers, by howling into the stars until the vibrations broke their own teeth. On some worlds, they were immune simply because they had already murdered any potential gateways before the enslavers could enter. But they could not stop the tide. Every mind is a candle. Eventually, even war dims. Zarek, the Silent King, understood what had happened before even his own generals did. The war was over. There would be no prize, no galaxy to rule, no species left to dominate or torment. The stars were growing quiet. The Citan had begun to turn on one another, lashing out in starvation and fury as their food vanished. The gods who had demanded worship were now mad things, hollow and glutted on absence. One by one, they began to spiral into madness, seeking to consume each other in a desperate attempt to hold on to their divinity. The Old Ones had disappeared, fled the galaxy, perhaps, or perished in corners unmarked by stars. The Aeldari were shattered, the Krork were scattered. The webway was broken in places that would never heal, and all around the enslavers fed. Sarek watched 1,000 systems go dark, not from conquest but from collapse, and in that moment he realized the ultimate futility of his war. He had won, and there was nothing left. Thus ended the war in heaven, not with victory or defeat, but with emptiness. The enslaver plague did what no weapon, no god, no empire could. It ended everything. It did not discriminate, it did not negotiate, it simply consumed. And when it was done, the galaxy slept. In the galaxy's stillness, after the screams had faded, after the last psychic flare had gone out, after the final vaults of the old ones were sealed, and the enslavers retreated into the warp's gluttonous depths, there came a silence unlike any before. Not peace, not healing, just vacancy. The stars still burned, but they no longer beckoned. Planets still turned, but they turned in mourning. And the Necrons remained, immortal, untouchable, alone. They had outlasted their enemies, but they had also outlasted meaning. Their creators, the Necrontyr, had been traded for soulless machines. Their gods, the Citan, still stalked the heavens, but now their hunger, once indulgently praised, had become a threat too vast to ignore. The very beings who had promised the Necrons immortality, who had whispered salvation and victory, now presided over a galaxy emptied of prey, their divine appetites unsatisfied, their true natures revealed. They were no longer gods. They were tyrants. Sharek, the silent king, had seen it coming. Perhaps he had always known. Perhaps even in the moment he struck his pact with the Satan, part of him had understood that gods who demand nothing in return are only waiting for the right moment to take everything. And now, with the old ones gone, the younger races decimated, and the warp choked with madness, the Citan turned their gaze inward, toward their loyal servants, toward the Necrons. The Citan were not of the galaxy. They were not bound to the laws of matter, or time, or causality. They had been born in the first fires of reality, before biology, before logic. They had been content to drift for eons, feeding slowly on the radiance of stars. It was the Necrontyr who had taught them hunger. And now they wanted more. With no mortal races left to dominate or devour, the Citan began to devour one another. Their arrogance could no longer be sated with offerings of energy or tribute. They began claiming territory, shattering ancient alliances, feuding in ways only creatures of abstract power could. Wars were fought not with armies, but with concepts. One Citan, Magladroth, the Void Dragon, disappeared into the core of a sun, dragging an entire Necron fleet behind it in a spiral of folded dimensions. Another, Nihilak, the Mirrorborn, fractured into 1,000 shards, each manifesting in a different system to wage a war against itself, collapsing the boundaries between identity and space. The Citan were unraveling, and the Necrons, once their servants, now their only remaining tether to material reality, were caught between devotion and dread. Some remained loyal, fanatics perhaps, or simply minds too eroded by biotransference to question divine command. They offered up the last biological remnants they could find, chasing rumors of surviving enclaves, dragging in feral xenos to be sacrificed in old rituals, hoping to delay the inevitable wrath of their deities. Others rebelled. The rebellion did not begin with a speech or a rallying cry. The Necrons had no songs, no morale, no brotherhood. They were not alive. But in their cold logic cores, something clicked into place. The war was over. The Citan had no purpose now but consumption. And logic dictated one course: kill the gods. It was the greatest heresy imaginable, and yet, in tomb complex after tomb complex, in the lightless vaults beneath dead moons and hollowed planets, the same conclusion was reached again and again. Independent Necron lords, war philosophers, cryptecs of incalculable age and intellect, all arrived at the same forbidden answer. The gods had to die. Of course, killing a god was no small thing, especially not a Citan. They were not creatures of flesh. Their bodies, forged from necrodermis, were only a vessel, a way to interact with reality. Their true form was a lattice of cosmic principles, woven into the fabric of energy itself. You could no more kill them with blades or gauss fire than you could stab a shadow. So the Necrons built tools, not weapons, not at first, tools of division. Machines that could fracture a Citan's essence, isolate threads of thought, shear one shard from another, bind power into static form. It was the cryptex, twisted techno-sorcerers of the Necron dynasties, who first invented the Tesseract Labyrinth, a prison of living dimension, folded upon itself in recursive logic, able to capture and hold fragments of a star god's essence. No one expected it to work. It did. The first Citan to fall was Landugor the Flayer. He had grown erratic, spreading madness among Necron warriors, turning legions into blood-crazed berserkers. Zarek himself authorized the trap. The Necron legions did not fight him. They baited him. They offered him a world still echoing with the thoughts of a recently deceased psychic species. Landugor descended like a ravenous flame. The trap snapped shut. His scream was heard not in sound but in structure. Walls cracked, engines died, starlight dimmed. But he did not escape. His form shattered, broken into 1,000 shards, each sealed in tesseract labyrinths and buried in tomb worlds locked beneath psychic null fields. And the rebellion spread. Citan after Citan were hunted. Some fought back, some fled. A few tried to plead, too late. The Necrons, once soulless warriors built to serve, had become executioners. They moved with absolute precision. No fury, no passion, just inevitability. The betrayal had been quiet, but absolute. Of the dozens of known Citan, nearly all were shattered. Those who remained were broken into fragments, no longer gods, but pieces of something that had once been terrible. The Necrons enslaved these shards, using them as weapons, as power sources, as batteries of cosmic might. Trapped in machines they once created, the Citan became tools of war, divine, but caged. Zarek watched it all, orchestrated it, but if he felt satisfaction, he never showed it. In the end, he had led his people from flesh to machine, from mortality to eternity, from desperation to dominion. He had cast down the gods. But at what cost? His empire was hollow, his people broken beyond repair. The galaxy was empty, bleeding from 1,000 wounds, its psychic fabric still scarred by the plague that had torn through it. The victory was too perfect, too clean, too final. And in that finality, the Silent King saw only a tomb, not for his enemies, for everyone. So he made one last choice. He gathered his remaining command codes, those that allowed him to direct the entire Necron race, hard-coded into their neural lattice since biotransference, and he severed them. He freed his people from his command, not to give them liberty. What liberty could they know as echoes of minds? But to give them the chance to find their own way, whatever that meant. To let them drift, sleep, rage, or rebuild as they would. And then he left. The Silent King departed the galaxy, his flagship slipping into the intergalactic void, vanishing beyond the rim. He sought understanding, perhaps penance, perhaps some answer to the unanswerable question that still haunted him. Had it been worth it? Behind him, the tomb worlds fell silent. The war in heaven was over. The gods were dead. The survivors were immortal. And the stars, for the first time in millions of years, were allowed to rest. But nothing ever truly rests forever. What does eternity mean to a race that cannot die? What is the shape of time when history itself lies beneath your feet, buried in vaults of unfeeling metal? The war in heaven had ended, not with a flourish, not with fanfare or victory songs, but with a quiet, inevitable implosion. The galaxy was broken, haunted, drained. The old ones had vanished into myth or oblivion. The young races were scattered, hounded, devolved. The C'tan were shattered, caged, enslaved, and the Necrons stood alone. Their triumph was absolute, and it was meaningless. In all their calculations, all their vengeance, they had never considered what came after. They had won the war, but there was no one left to rule, no order to impose, no enemy to hate. There was only the endless silence of a galaxy too damaged to care. And so the Necrons, once the Necrontyr, once a people of passion and pride, chose to sleep. It began not as a command, but as a whisper, spreading through the dynasties like an instinct encoded into the very circuitry of their hollow minds. The war was over. The galaxy had nothing left to offer. Let time pass, let the wounds heal, let the dust of forgotten stars settle before they rose again. Zarek, the Silent King, was gone. His voice, if it could ever be called that, was silent now even in data signal. He had severed the last of the command protocols, linking him to the Necron race. In doing so, he gifted them autonomy. And with that autonomy came weariness. For the first time in untold eons, they had no orders, no purpose. They turned inward. Across 1,000 systems, the tomb worlds prepared for slumber. Entire planets became sarcophagi. The preparations were monumental, undertaken not with urgency, but with the measured, timeless discipline of machines who had all the time in the universe. Vast tomb complexes, already deep beneath planetary surfaces, were expanded further still. Vaults the size of cities were constructed to house the dormant legions. Command centers were sealed behind quantum encryption, guarded by protocols designed to activate only under the most specific and improbable of circumstances. Atop the surface, great pylons were raised, monuments to stillness. These were not warnings. They were anchors, structures that would serve as temporal and dimensional stabilizers, ensuring the Necrons would remain untouched by the chaos of passing ages. In many cases, entire star systems were turned into defense grids, their orbits mined with dormant weapons, their moons hollowed into surveillance relays. The galaxy might burn again. That was inevitable. But the Necrons would not. They would wait. And when they awoke, they would rebuild the galaxy in their image. The process of entering stasis was as precise as a ritual. But it was not a ritual of faith. The Necrons had no gods now. It was a ritual of necessity. Each Necron warrior was placed into an alcove, cradled in the embrace of charging coils and memory locks. Sleep did not come like it does to mortals. There was no drift, no dreams. Only an immediate stillness as every data loop closed, every thought suspended, every sensor dimmed. Even the cryptechs, the genius scientists of the dynasties, entered slumber, locking their experiments in temporal folds, leaving behind vast data vaults encrypted in dead languages, hidden in tombs designed to never be found. Some, of course, resisted. Not every Necron chose to sleep. Some lords, their sanity long eroded by time and trauma, declared themselves eternal stewards of the galaxy. They refused stasis, instead building micro-empires in hollow asteroids and dead systems, patrolling the void with half-functional fleets. Others grew paranoid, convinced that if they slept, they would never wake. These built gauntlets of traps around their tombs, encoded layers of misleading instructions, sealed themselves in vaults no other Necron could unlock. A few, mad cryptechs, warrior lords drunk on autonomy, went rogue. They took with them fragments of shattered C'tan, forbidden war engines, forbidden data. They delved into experimentation so blasphemous that even Sharek, had he still been present, might have condemned them. These were anomalies, unpredictable, dangerous, unstable. But they were tolerated, because even in madness they obeyed the one truth that now ruled Necron kind. Let the galaxy heal, let it forget. And so the ages turned, empires rose, fell, rose again, stars were born, bloomed, and died. The younger races, those spared total extinction, began to rise anew. The Eldar slowly clawed back their civilization from the brink, building graceful craft worlds in the webway's remains. The Krork devolved into the Orcs, less organized but no less dangerous, and infinitely more numerous. Other species emerged from the shadows, the Toh, the Kroot, the Hrood. Humanity, fragile, young, reckless, spread like wildfire, and in its spread began to brush the dust, covering ancient tombs. But they did not know. None of them did, because the Necrons did not stir. Their tombs remained sealed, their weapons silent, their dreams, if they could dream, untouched by the war songs and madness that would follow. And in this long silence, a myth began to form. On some worlds, broken monoliths half buried in the soil became sites of religious pilgrimage. In others, strange signal interference would cripple machines near ancient ruins, interpreted as curses or hauntings. Blackstone pylons, still humming faintly beneath the earth, were uncovered and feared, misunderstood as alien relics or demon fangs. No one understood what lay beneath. No one remembered the names of those who waited. Not yet. But time is not an ally, not even to the undying. As the galaxy spun, the stasis systems, perfect though they were, began to fail. Not catastrophically, but with the inevitability of entropy, of subtle degradation. A failsafe missed here, a power surge there, a tomb world left too close to a growing pulsar, glitches in command protocols, fractures in the memory stasis loops. The first Necrons began to awaken, blind, alone, confused. Some rose believing the war still raged. Others awoke with fragmented minds, their thoughts shattered by the trauma of biotransference and the weight of time. Some tombs activated only partially, releasing half-functioning warriors into a galaxy they no longer recognized. The Great Sleep was ending, not by plan, but by decay. The tomb worlds began to stir, and the galaxy, already reeling from the rise of chaos, from the fall of the Eldar, from the madness of humanity's expansion, would soon discover the oldest nightmare it had ever forgotten. They would learn, too late, that some victories are pauses, some silences are warnings, and some dreams, no matter how deep they are buried, wake up screaming. The Necrons had not died. They had simply waited, and the time of waiting was nearly done. The galaxy would learn their name again, not from history, but from fire. The galaxy forgot. That is the most dangerous part of the war in heaven, not the scale of its violence, not the devastation it wrought, but that it passed into myth. The scars remain, but the cause is lost. The silence of the Necrons was not just the absence of war, it was the slow decay of remembrance. Time, that cruel curator, filed the war away behind newer terrors and fresher blood. The young races rebuilt atop a graveyard they didn't know was there, and beneath them, the sleepers stirred. Not all at once, not in fanfare, not with the trumpets of doom or fleets rising from the void. It began as anomalies, faint at first, whispered by augurs and dismissed by adepts who did not understand what they were seeing. A magnetic storm where none should exist. A series of vox ghosts repeating a forgotten dialect across the range of starships. Faint pulses of gravitic interference deep below the crust of an uninhabited world. Monoliths emerging from beneath the sands as if unearthed by the breath of time itself. The Imperium of man, young, furious, stretched thin across the stars, was among the first to see the signs. But like all others before them, they misunderstood. The Mechanicus called the ruins Archaeotech, sacred remnants of the dark age of technology. They catalogued tomb complexes as dead zones, their systems glitching and data collapsing when proximity was breached. They tried to strip the monoliths of their metals, only to watch servitors dissolve into smoke and static. Explorator teams vanished, warning signs were ignored, and still they dug. The Eldari fared no better. They remembered the war in heaven in fragments, half legend, half warning. Their Farsayers saw tomb worlds as black holes in fate, places even the strands of destiny refused to touch. But arrogance is not unique to man. Many among the craft worlds believed the ancient threat dead, scattered, lost, and so they stepped into the forgotten places, seeking to cleanse or reclaim. They were wrong, because the tombs had begun to awaken. Each tomb world was unique, shaped by the dynasty that once ruled it, designed by minds that no longer remembered warmth or voice or sky. But all shared the same core: silence, order, and patience. Now that silence was breaking, the first tombs reactivated not by design, but by decay. Faults in containment systems, radiation bursts from nearby stellar events, drifting void fleets that triggered ancient proximity alarms. Even chaos itself, ever eager to corrupt, sometimes triggered tomb awakenings with psychic dissonance alone. And when they did awaken, they did not rise as one people. They rose fragmented, damaged, changed. The process of biotransference had never been perfect. Not all Necrons retained identity or clarity. For some, the long sleep had corrupted their minds even further, rendering once proud lords into delusional tyrants, warriors into beasts. Memories frayed, protocols broke, entire dynasties awoke in madness. On the world of Necrontyr, the tomb world lit up with cascading error codes. Its overlord, once a calculating strategist of galactic renown, rose as a gibbering mad thing. His neural lattice degraded to the point that he believed the stars themselves conspired against him. He ordered his fleets to fire into the void for decades, creating an artificial nebula of glass and ash. On Yiltan, the cryptex awoke to discover their master code overwritten by an echo of the Citan they had once served. Though the star gods were shattered, some of their fragments had persisted like viruses in the Necron system. The tomb's entire population was reborn with a shared hallucination that they were the Citan made flesh. They renamed their dynasty the Eater's Court and began building vast soul harvest engines to prepare for a return that would never come. But not all were broken. On the tomb world of Mandragora, the Sautik dynasty awoke intact, their command protocols functioning, their databanks preserved. Their pharaoh, Imhotep, the Storm Lord, emerged with a mind cold and clear. He did not scream at the void. He remembered. And he began to plot, not out of vengeance or rage, but out of duty. The galaxy had forgotten the Necrons. Imhotep would teach them to remember. Elsewhere, other dynasties stirred. Some began repairing their ancient ships, dark obelisks rising from beneath oceans and deserts, casting shadows over confused colonists who could not understand what had changed. Some began probing nearby stars, scanning for traces of the old ones, never realizing they had long since vanished. Others, curious and cautious, observed the younger species like a biologist observing insects, and in rare cases, contact was made. It did not go well. On Arvandor Secundus, a Mechanicus excavation force uncovered a partially active tomb complex. They descended into it with reverence, unaware of what they had disturbed. They mistook the Necron Canoptech constructs for auto-defenses. They mistook the cryptex logic pulses as command nodes to be interfaced with. Only one fragment of the last Vox capture remains. They are not machines. They are awake. They're watching us. They see, and then static. The entire expedition vanished. Their ship's orbit was redirected. A black beam of light sliced across the vessel's core, severing it without explosion or sound. Nothing was recovered. The tomb had resumed its function. The galaxy began to murmur. Reports filtered into the Inquisition, the Eldar councils, even the scattered TOW outposts. Impossible technologies moving across dead systems, shadows where augurs should read nothing. Soldiers disappearing with no trace, monoliths gliding through space with no propulsion, no emissions, just purpose. The Eldari knew the name, even if they whispered it only in the oldest tongues. Necrontyr. The Imperium coined their own. Necrons. Ancient, mechanical, malevolent. But the galaxy still didn't understand. How could it? These were not invaders. They were not a new threat. They were the oldest, the original architects of war, the first empire to span the stars. They did not want conquest. They wanted restoration. Each Necron dynasty believed itself the rightful heir to a galaxy that had grown unruly and chaotic in their absence. Humanity, Eldari, Orc, they were weeds in the garden. The Necrons had no hatred for them. Hatred is a passion. The Necrons had only objectives, and those objectives were clear. Rebuild, reclaim, reorder. Not all dynasties agreed. Rifts began to emerge. The Mefrit dynasty sought annihilation. Their stasis crypts had corrupted their neural pathways, leaving them with only a hunger for silence. They began sterilizing systems, not to rule them, but to erase them. Planets turned to glass. Suns collapsed into silence. The Neolach, proud and methodical, believed diplomacy might be viable, if only to bide time. They studied the younger races, considering alliances or manipulation, not out of mercy, but as tools. The Sautek, ever pragmatic, desired war, but on their terms. Not reckless slaughter, not madness, a campaign of reclamation. And behind it all, far from the edge of galactic memory, something else moved. Rumors spread among Necron cryptechs of a signal. Ancient, familiar, drifting from beyond the void. A command line embedded in a pattern older than any tomb. A signature left by one being, Sarek, the Silent King. He had left them, but perhaps he was returning. The echoes of the war in heaven were no longer echoes. They were footsteps. And the galaxy, so full of war, so drunk on its own stories, had no idea that the war it now fought was simply the sequel to a tale written in stone, buried in silence, and whispered by machines who no longer remembered how to die. The Necrons had returned, not as conquerors, but as heirs. And the galaxy? It was theirs to claim. Again. They thought he was a myth, a name buried in stasis vaults and half-lost memory cores. A protocol long since deleted, a figure whose silence had lasted so long, even those who had once obeyed him without question had begun to doubt he'd ever existed. But the galaxy moves in cycles, and in the deep, cold dark between galaxies, something ancient was stirring. Sarek, the Silent King, was returning, not because he had been found, but because he had seen enough. He had left when the war was over, not in cowardice, not in defeat, but in grim resignation. He had watched the stars dim, watched the old ones vanish, watched his people become machines, watched the gods fall to pieces under the weight of their own hubris. He had led them to victory, and in doing so had doomed them to emptiness. So Sarek had taken his crownless throne and turned away from the galaxy, past the outer arms, beyond the veiled region, into the void between galaxies, where the stars thin into nothingness and only gravity remembers what once was. His fleet had followed, silent tomb ships gliding on dark matter currents, powered by engines no younger race had ever deciphered. He did not sleep. He did not think as mortals do, but he observed, and he learned. There is no stasis in the void, only perspective. What Sarek saw disturbed him. From that place beyond the edge, he watched the slow rot of the galaxy. Not in years or decades, but in epochs. He saw the warp thicken, saw it pulse like a bruise across the fabric of real space. He watched the birth of chaos, its gods, its demons, its lies. He saw the Eldari rise from the ruins of the war in heaven, only to fall into their own decadence and doom. He felt the psychic cry that tore Slaanesh into being, a shriek so loud it echoed into the void. He saw craft worlds break, gods die, souls devoured. He watched the orcs spread like spores, senseless and unstoppable, a laughing plague that even death could not silence. He saw humanity crawl from the dirt of old Earth, fragile, blind, chaotic. And he saw it ignite, a candle in the dark, bright and hot and burning itself with every step. He watched the rise of the Imperium, the birth of the Emperor, the great crusades and the heresies, the madness of faith, the collapse of reason. And in all of it he saw patterns. Chaos devoured the strong, entropy claimed the willful, and order was fading. Sarek had once sought to impose order on the galaxy through conquest. Now he realized the truth. The galaxy must be saved from itself. The Silent King turned his ships toward home. His fleet, forgotten by time, slid into the Milky Way like a shadow returning to its source. In his absence, the Necrons had stirred, fragmented, misaligned, some shattered by decay, others awakened by error. They were alive, but leaderless, without unity, without clarity. They had become tools without hands to wield them. So Sarek returned to lead, not to reclaim the crown, but to fulfill the one purpose that remained, to restore order to a galaxy on the brink. He did not announce himself with banners or parades. He came like a storm on the edge of memory. Tomb worlds long dormant began to stir, not randomly as before, but in sequence. Coordinated, purposeful. Dynasty after dynasty received encrypted pulses bearing an ancient signature, one encoded at the moment of biotransference, buried in the deepest strata of every Necron's core. Only one being carried that signal, the Silent King. At first, there was disbelief. Some refused to answer the call. Others fell to their knees, metaphorically or literally, rebooting protocols that had not activated in 60 million years. Warrior legions stood motionless, then turned in perfect unison to await new orders. The Pharaons debated. Some raged at Sharek's return, declaring him a relic, irrelevant. Others welcomed him, eager for a return to unity. Many feared him. All remembered him. He was the one who had led them through death. Now he would lead them through the future. Sarek began his work not with conquest, but with correction. His agents moved swiftly, silent emissaries bearing authority older than suns. Rogue dynasties were given a choice, rejoin or be erased. Many resisted. Their worlds were sealed in dimensional stasis, their tombs encoded with Viric plagues. Others were simply silenced by black fleets that struck from the dark, dismantling their memory cores before they could react. But for every world that fell, 10 rejoined. The Necrons were not fools. They understood the weight of Sarek's presence. Where he walked, order followed, hierarchies realigned, command chains restored, ancient systems recalibrated. The galaxy was spiraling toward ruin. Only the Necrons had the discipline, the patience, the endurance to stop it. Under Sarek's guidance, the Necrons were not reborn, but reforged. The Silent King did not forget the Citan. He had watched them shatter. He had seen what became of them, fragments caged, used as weapons, degraded into cosmic batteries. Tools once feared, now enslaved. It was justice, but not yet complete. Sarek ordered the recovery of all Stan shards, not for destruction, but for containment. He would not repeat the mistakes of the past. The Citan were not gods. They were phenomena, dangerous as solar flares, but predictable when understood. In time, he whispered to his inner court, they might even be used again. Properly, safely, under control. He did not seek vengeance. He sought balance. And still, he watched the younger races. He sent probes into the heart of the Imperium, deep beneath the dying Astronomicon, to observe its reliance on a being who claimed divinity through silence and war. He sent emissary constructs to the edges of Eldari space, studying how they twisted the webway's broken arteries to keep running from their sins. He mapped Orc migrations, cataloged Terranid movements. He did not fear them, but he understood them now. The galaxy was not his enemy. Chaos was. It had no shape, no form, no logic. It unmade progress. It twisted purpose. It whispered lies and fed on the collapse of unity. It had no allegiance, and thus it could never be reasoned with. Only eliminated. This, Sharek decided, was his final war. Not against races or species or dynasties, but against chaos itself, in all its forms. He would not raise his armies in blind conquest. He would move with precision, targeted strikes, diplomacy where useful, annihilation where necessary. No more galactic-wide, scorched earth campaigns. This was surgical restoration. And when he spoke, if he ever spoke, his voice came not in sound but in transmission. Pure, clean, undeniable. Order is not peace. Order is not stillness. Order is the freedom to endure, and endure they would. The Silent King had returned, not as a monarch, but as a surgeon, a scalpel to carve away the sickness, a voice to reawaken purpose. A king, yes, but no longer silent, not because he had found his voice, but because now the galaxy must listen, and if it does not, then it will learn, as it once did in ancient nights. The Necrons do not forget, and neither does their king. The stars are older now. They flicker dimmer, burn slower. Their light, once the silent witness to ancient atrocities, now falls upon new empires built atop the bones of forgotten gods. But their silence has changed. It is not the silence of peace. It is the hush before the scream. A galaxy once bathed in the fury of the war in heaven has become, once more, a crucible, not of one war but of many, countless, layered like dust on a tomb, and the Necrons have returned to it, not as invaders, not even as rulers, but as corrective force. There is no fanfare when a tomb world awakens. There is no declaration of war. There is only the sudden hush of Vox traffic, the flickering out of orbital satellites, the lights dimming in outposts one by one, like candles snuffed by unseen fingers. When the Imperium finally notices, when scouts are sent, or when a rogue trader goes missing, it's already too late. The monoliths are already rising. Obelisks of black, geometrically perfect and impossibly vast, tearing through soil and strata with no more resistance than a knife through cloth. From beneath them, legions emerge, not roaring, not shouting, but marching. Step by step, each footfall echoing across the remains of planetary crust like the ticking of some terrible cosmic clock. There is no rage in them. There is only resolve. Where once the Necrons had been divided, they now move with grim intent. Under Sarek's distant eye, the dynasties are not a scattered collection of tomb kingdoms any longer. They are instruments, each tuned to its own frequency, yes, but playing from the same script. Some operate like surgical blades, carving away chaos cults before they bloom. Others act as architects, landing on primitive worlds and building obelisks that pulse with anti-warp energy, cutting off demonic incursions before they can manifest. The Imperium, the Eldar, the Tau, they don't understand it. Not fully. Not yet. They still think of the Necrons as machines. They do not yet grasp what the Necrons have become. what they were always meant to be. There are still battles, of course. Many. The Necrons do not negotiate with threats. When the Krork descend upon a tomb world, hollering and smashing their crude, oil-stained machines into ancient pylons, they are met with clean, silent annihilation. Gauss flares remove their molecular structure in disciplined volleys. Immortals march through clouds of spores, unblinking. When chaos emerges, when a demon prince howls through a tear in real space and drags with it a tide of screaming fanatics, the Necrons do not pray. They activate pylons. Webs of blackstone come alive. The immaterium recoils, howling, as its tendrils are severed mid-thrust. And then, with the warp gone still, the Necrons advance, not in rage, but in ritual. Erasure is not punishment. It is purification. These are not acts of vengeance. They are maintenance. The galaxy does not sit idle. The Imperium, seeing the re-emergence of the Necrons, responds the only way it knows how: violently. Naval fleets descend on awakened tomb worlds with righteous fury, sermons roaring from loudspeakers even as plasma torpedoes detonate in upper atmospheres. Astartes chapters make landfall, striking like divine hammers to crush what they view as heretical and alien. And many succeed at first, but the Necrons do not fight like any known enemy. They do not react, they do not flinch, they do not panic. They vanish mid-battle, only to reappear in rear lines. They turn the battlefield into a puzzle, and while the Imperium bleeds to solve it, the Necrons have already won. Not all conflicts end in death. On some occasions, Sarek's emissaries appear, single constructs forged in regal perfection, bearing symbols older than mankind itself. They do not speak, but their presence alone transmits warning, a negotiation of sorts. This world is not yours, it never was. The Imperium rarely listens, and so the Necrons cleanse it. But Sarek watches more than he acts. He is patient. His return is not yet a proclamation. He knows the galaxy cannot be fixed by conquest alone. There are too many variables, too many players. The Eldari teeter on the brink of extinction and rebirth, wielding psychic power with a desperation that will, inevitably, birth catastrophe once more. The Toes seek unity, but their understanding of the galaxy is that of a child holding a loaded lasgun, ambition without wisdom. The Tyranids press inward from the galactic rim, a hunger older than language. And chaos never sleeps. Its gods churn within the warp, swollen with stolen faith and rotting desire. Its agents infest every level of reality, from lowly cultists to corrupted demigods. Sharek knows this cannot be undone by simple war. It must be managed. The Necrons were once conquerors. Now they must become wardens. And this is the paradox that defines them. They are soulless, but they may be the galaxy's only chance for sanity. Within the dynasties, old politics stir. Not all Tharons agree with Sarek's vision. Some, like Anrakir the Traveler, believe in cooperation, in curiosity, in the preservation of life as part of a greater order. Others, like Trazyn the Infinite, collect knowledge and history, hoarding the past in stasis vaults not out of greed, but a manic compulsion to remember what the galaxy refuses to. But some, like Nemesor Zandrek, live in fractured delusion, enacting campaigns of war as if the war in heaven never ended. Worse still are those who still worship the Citan shards, mistaking their broken brilliance for divine rebirth. These rogue dynasties threaten to unravel the fragile order Sarek works to weave. He does not hesitate. Where diplomacy fails, fleets follow. Even now, the Silent King makes war upon his own, not from pride, but necessity. A corrupted Necron is not an enemy. It is a malfunction, and Sarek will not tolerate imperfection. In the deep void beneath black stars, a meeting takes place. The Silent King stands before an ancient obelisk pulsing with coded messages, a remnant of the old ones, recovered from the webway. It no longer holds data. It holds a warning. He deciphers it alone. The message is clear. The warp is not done. It grows. It learns. It watches the Necrons as surely as the Necrons watch it. The gods of chaos are not content to feast on mortals. They remember the war in heaven. They remember the enemy who could not be turned. They fear the Necrons not for their strength, but for their clarity. There will come a time when chaos rises in full, when not even the Astronomicon burns, when demons walk openly across the stars. When that time comes, the Necrons will not retreat. They will answer, and Zarek will lead them, not as a tyrant, not as a king, but as the last sane voice in a galaxy of screams. The long war has begun again, but this time it is not Necron against Old One. It is Necron against madness, and in the end it may be that the cold, unliving hands of the Necrons are the only ones steady enough to hold the galaxy together. Until the stars die at last, until the silence returns. And this time, it stays.